Good morning, everyone. I want to make sure that I honor your time. And so we are going to kick off this final masterclass on passionate writers, even though I will tell you this, this is not the end of this work by any means. And it was fascinating creating the slides for this session because I was like, oh, I could talk about this and this and this and this and this and, 75,000 things that are running through my head. And yet that's just not the time we've been given. So to continue the conversation, I would encourage you to show up for office hours. They are not recorded. The next one is tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Central Time, so 7 p.m. PST, just to kind of switch things up. And then there's another one coming up, I believe, on Monday or Sunday. I can't remember at the moment. But without further ado, this is the final part of the masterclass, kind of diving into writing identity. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and then we'll get started. As always, I have the chat box up and oh, now my computer wants to do crazy stuff. And I have this chat box up, and so I will be taking a look at it throughout, and we'll ask you to
Are you there? I can't hear anything.
My computer decided to kick me off when I tried to share my screen, so that was fun. So we're going to try again. We are still recording, so that's a fun little technical glitch. See if I can share my screen. Okay, here we go. So we have talked, either welcome or welcome back, depending on where you are in this journey. I want to make sure that you can actually see my screen. Can you see my screen? Will you answer in the chat box for me? Yes, okay, good. Then I will. So one of the things that we've talked about, and whether you're new to this masterclass and just catching in now or have been with me since day one, is, how do we keep each child at the center of our work? And yesterday I was sitting and listening to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who is phenomenal, a phenomenal researcher and writer and thinker and educational theorist and just educator overall, in a webinar. And she started talking about, of course, the changes that need to happen in our classrooms. And this quote really stuck out to me amongst many, because this is so true, right? Shakespeare didn't write a five paragraph essay. And yet how many of the traditions that we're passing on in our school do we continue to push on to kids and then wonder, why aren't they blossoming into beautiful, creative writers? And I think about the structures that we have in place and how they become barriers rather than scaffolds. And so as I was preparing these final slides, I wanted to honor the questions that have been coming up kind of throughout the weeks, but also kind of finish the cycle of how does this look in my classroom? And so going back to kind of our central question, which has been guiding the work and guiding my thinking throughout the past many years where I've been diving into this myself, is just how often do we teach students to write this certain way because that's what good writers do, without recognizing that what good writers do, there is no one way, right? And that even throwing the term good in there starts to indicate certain benchmarks that maybe kids don't feel like they can actually live up to. And so I was, one of my favorite authors is Nick Stone, and I was searching on her website for a different article, and I came across this in her frequently asked questions. And once again, it kind of mirrors what Angie Stone was saying too, in the quote that I used in the past masterclass part 2, was this like notion of of people not assuming that they could be writers because people don't see themselves reflected in the writers that we expose them to, as well as just the writing that we do. And so here again, we have another very famous YA author saying, you know, I didn't think that this was going to be something for me. And because I didn't see me or someone who looked like me reflected in what I was seeing. And that was the same with Angie Stone, and that was the same with Jason Reynolds, et cetera, some of the biggest children's books authors that we have right now. And so how many of our students would sit there and go, yeah, absolutely, I agree with that 100%. So whose writing process is it that we're teaching? Because it doesn't seem to be the one that many of us actually use. And so one of the things that I have invited my students into is starting to think about real writers. And I use that term loosely because we're all real writers. So we could call it published writers, or hey, those writers whose books you get really excited about when they finally get published, or they go to Barnes and Noble or wherever it is they go to get their books. And so I tell my students these things, that they have their own writing process. They don't actually always write. You don't always see them scribbling in a notebook or on a MacBook or wherever it is they do their writing. You know, they stop one thing to start another, sometimes coming back to the thing they stopped, and other times they simply don't. They focus on a few items when revising, or they throw it all out and start over. They don't actually publish everything that they write. I was just reading an article Meg Medina had written, and she was talking about how she has this file folder of things that she's started that she really doesn't think is ever going to see the light of day. You know, they throw away some of their writing. One of the times we spoke to Linda Mulele Hunt, and she was writing her latest book, and she was telling my students, she's like, you know, I was on a deadline and I got to the end and I was ready to submit it. And then I realized that I didn't like what I'd written and I actually needed to go back and rewrite the whole thing. And the kids were like, what? And she's like, yep, I changed the story completely. And that was at a deadline. Real writers or published writers also persevere, right? I think about rejection. I think about the harshness sometimes of the editing process. I think about the slammed doors, the closed doors, or being told that their voice doesn't belong, or all of the things that have created obstacles for them to go from having a manuscript to having it published. And then also that published writers create even if they're afraid. There are a lot of interviews out there where writers and creators talk about how they didn't know how something was going to be received, or they were really worried about it, and yet they persevered through that, and they sat down even if they felt like they weren't the person that could write a story like this, or even if they were the person that didn't feel like their words matter, they would still create. And so I think about how we need to embrace that fear as well, that a lot of kids, at least in my experience, feel like they have not been given the mantle of what it means to write. And they haven't been given permission to be a writer. And so that's one of the things that I want to make sure that I always tell my students is, you are a writer. And it sounds so dumb, and especially by 7th grade where they've probably been told that before. But I think about the authors that again and again will remind us, there was a teacher, right, that told me that my words had value, that made me believe that this was something I could pursue. I don't know which of my students are going to pursue writing. So I want to make sure that all of my students, not just the ones whose brilliance blows me away in 7th grade, that all of my students hear that their voice has power and that they should really continue to pursue their writing. The great thing is, though, that I've been telling my students this, and my students have been promptly ignoring all of my fantastic advice, because why should they listen to me? I'm just a teacher. Even though I have published books, etc., I don't really write real books, as my students point out. And so me saying that authors have lots of different processes, sure, that's just another teacher thing to say. So instead of taking my word on it, one of the tools that I've used throughout the years is speaking to actual authors. So authors whose picture books we have in our classroom, or books that we have sitting in our classrooms. And Kate Messner, who I really appreciate for many different reasons. She has incredible books out. Her new History Smashers series is quite phenomenal, and one that should be added to elementary and middle school classrooms, and even high school, where she takes kind of what we think we know about history and then completely blows it up. And the first one is about the Mayflower, and it was really eye-opening. But she also has a resource on her website. So if you just search this, Kate Messner, Authors Who Skype for Free. Now, with the pandemic, this may have changed a little bit as far as who is giving freely of their time, but I have a feeling that there are still authors who are willing to do this. And so you can go on that website and you can search for authors who will fit your purpose, or just authors whose name you recognize or whose books look interesting. And you can contact them to ask for a free 15-minute Skype interview, or Skype or whichever kind of virtual tool interview. Now, there are many purposes for these phone calls, or for these meetings, but the first one that I've wanted to focus with my students on has simply been, what is your process as a writer? And so there was a year where we did this quite frequently. I was able to kind of fit it in really well, and it became kind of a thing that we did all year, where we wanted to talk to as many authors as possible and creators as possible, and we wanted to compare their writing processes. And so imagine a sleepy Monday morning where my 7th graders have just kind of stumbled in. It's 7:45. At 8 a.m., we have our first Skype call. And up pops Phil Bildner, who, by the way, has written one of the best middle grade books that I've read in the last couple of years that just came out. A high five for Glenn Burke. Absolutely phenomenal. Must add to so many classrooms. But Phil has graciously agreed to Skype with my 7th graders. Now, if you've been around middle schoolers or just kids on Monday morning, you probably know how tired they are, right? And Phil bursts onto the screen with all of his energy. He is one of the best Skype calls that we've ever had. And he's talking to the kids, and a kid kind of slowly shuffles up and he goes, okay, well, what's your writing process? And Phil just looks at the kids and he goes, my writing process is like diarrhea. And the kids immediately turn and look at me, because here's an author that just told them that his writing process is like diarrhea. And Phil goes, yeah, just get it all out and then you clean it up. And the kids are like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? And so I think about that, because of course, all through the year, I had kids that were like, yeah, my writing process is like diarrhea, Mrs. Ripp. I just got to get it out and then I'll deal with it. Then I'll clean up the mess. That left such an impression on the kids, hearing that from a published author whose picture books we had been sitting and reading, right? Going, yeah, I just get it out. It's kind of a mess. That's okay. I can fix it. And I think that that's often one of the barriers that kids face. We talked to other authors, and I remember distinctly that year, one author talking to us said to the kids, and he goes, don't ever believe when somebody says, and then I woke up in the middle of the night and the idea just came to me and it was fully formed and I knew I just had to write it and I wrote the book and it was done. He's like, no, writing is a ton of work. You get like this baby idea and then you come back to it and maybe it takes years, and writing is work. The next week, same class, we're talking to a different author. I kid you not, the author goes, and then one night, the idea just came to me. And I knew I had to get up and I had to make sure that I sat down and I wrote this book. And it was like the book wrote itself. And of course, my kids are like, oh, they're lying. And I was like, no, it shows the differences in processes. And so I think about how absolutely incredibly important it is if we can connect kids either live with people who do this work or go and watch their videos. So one of the things that I've done too this year is when I do a book talk is that after I've book talked the book, I like to show a short clip of the author, of the creator behind the book, so kids can see what they look like, so kids can get some writing advice from them. Sometimes I can't find a good video, so then I just try to share a quote or something like that, but I always try to show an image as well, just so they can see what do these authors look like, because I think even kids and sometimes adults have this very static way of what an author looks like and also what their process is. And so I think about how can we kind of gather all these golden nuggets of what do real writers go through, published writers. And I remember reading this and going, oh my gosh, Kate DiCamillo was rejected 473 times because of Winn-Dixie. And yet she persevered, right? And so when our kids sit there and hold out their narrative piece or hold out their writing piece and they go, well, this is terrible, nobody likes it, how are we handling that? Are we showing them are we showing, quotes like this or facts like this? Or are we saying, oh yeah, you're right, that's not any good, right? And so I think about that sometimes too, the type of writing that we write just needs to find the right audience, just needs to find the right person. And I'll tell my students that, just like when I abandon a book and I book talk it, and I'll tell my kids, I wasn't the right audience for this. So who is? And that's why too, we start thinking about, who are we producing for? Because it has to be someone that's not just nameless. So there are a lot of writing practices that we should examine within our classrooms. And I know that this also sometimes comes down to the curriculum that we're asked to use, right? But I want you to think about this. How many traditions are simply passed on in our writing practices where we don't really question whether they're good for the students or not, because it's kind of what we were taught, or it's kind of what we were taught in college, or wherever it is that whatever has shaped our writing practices. And we don't examine it and we don't question it, and it just becomes more of the same. Why is it that I can sit and compare myself to my 18-year-old niece and go, man, they're still teaching you that because that's what I was taught 25 years ago or more. And so some of the ones that I have distinctly tried to examine within my own practice is, for example, the forced partnerships. And I used to use this a lot. I spent a lot of time figuring out who was going to write with who was going to edit each other's work. So this also goes hand in hand with those peer editing checklists, because once I created the partnership, then I knew that I had to create the most beautiful, brilliant peer editing checklist so that kids could for sure look for the things that I needed them to look for. But I don't know about you, but in my experience, did not matter how beautiful the peer editing checklist was, kids still just kind of went through the notions and checked all the boxes and would say, yes, 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 all of this is there and present and accounted for. And I would turn and I'd be like, no, but it's not, because they didn't know how to be editors. Why would they? If they're still developing their writing skills, why would we ever expect kids to be able to edit each other's work? And then we layer on top the emotions that come through being forced into a partnership with someone that you might not have a relationship with. Now, I think about this a lot because I've had my books edited, obviously. And one of the reasons why I think that passionate readers and passionate learners turned out the way that they did is because I trusted my editor to do things and help me with it. Other books that I've written, it was harder because the editor and I didn't have the same relationship. And so when I think about how I can partner kids up, and I'll go more specifically into this, we use writing circles, or if it's just a short-term partner up, I always do a trio rather than a partnership when possible. Because that way you have two people going through someone's writing, looking at it in different ways and partnering up. And so the responsibility of being the strong writer or whatever it is within the partnership doesn't fall on one child. This also means that we can put kids of different abilities together in the trio so that they can help each other. And so it's not like a high-low kind of partnership or whatever you want to call it, where one kid doesn't feel like they're able to add anything to the conversation and then feel foolish. I think also that forced sharing and celebrations is something that we need to talk about, because we've talked a lot about the emotions that surround us in writing, and we're not going to want to share every single time. And I think that this is also where it becomes like a very fake type of writing, because we tell kids like, oh, we're going to celebrate and we're going to share. No, sometimes we're just going to move on. And those who want to share and those who want their writing celebrated, yes, let's do that. But we can also do it on a non-public way, right? Like, I'm going to celebrate you. Like I've said before, my students really appreciate stickers for some reason, and so I'm all about it. I'm going to bring in some stickers, or write beautiful things on Post-its and attach it to the work. We also have to think about like what is proper English, and this is another thing too that Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings talked about in her webinar yesterday, is that we have to think about what whose culture are we centering, right? And that really kids should become both fluent in their own culture and also the mainstream culture. But that also means that our white kids, who often equate mainstream with their own culture, need to become fluent in other cultures. And she does a much better job, obviously, of discussing it. But it makes me think about this whole notion of what is proper English. And what we've talked about, kind of what are the rules that we want to break within English, and why are we using these tools? Now, this becomes a little bit tricky if you're sitting with younger students where you're just trying to teach them the rules of English, and then it's a little harder to be like, okay, let's break everything that I've just taught you. So you know your kids best. I think about the experimentation that I certainly can do within 7th grade English because of all the teachers that have come before me. Things like how many drafts they write before they're done. I'll let you know that sometimes my first draft is my published draft on my blog. Sometimes you can tell, sometimes you can't. But I think we so quickly fall into that, oh, once you're done, you've only just begun. And so I think that this is also part of the process that we need to hand over control over to students, right? That we have to think about, like, oh, maybe this child really feels like they are done at this point. Great. What do you want to do? Do you want to continue revising, or do you want to start something else? Because we're going to continue writing. And so it's just, what do you want to work on? Of course, the whole one process for all, we've talked about that. The 5-paragraph essay, going back to Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, right? Shakespeare didn't write a 5-paragraph essay. Why is it we continue to show students that this is the way to write something? How many sentences in a paragraph? How many words in a sentence? Like, all of these rules are things that we really should examine, because all of these rules are meant to help kids, but instead end up becoming obstacles. And so we were talking about in the Passionate Readers Facebook group too, as far as, like, you know, well, the 5-paragraph essay, for example, or how many sentences in a paragraph is a scaffold. But when do we remove those scaffolds? Because if this is a tool that we use all year, then it is now no longer a scaffold. Then it's an actual instructional tool. Scaffolds are meant to be temporary, not to be a yearly thing. And so I also encourage you to have these conversations with people in other grade levels than you. Because if they're sitting and using the 5-paragraph essay, and you're using the 5-paragraph essay, et cetera, then it's no longer a scaffold. Then we have moved it past its purpose. And so I think about writing, and especially this notion of, like, when we hand someone something that we've written, whether handwritten or typed, there's no place to hide. That is so much of our skills, abilities, personalities down on paper. And so how are we handling the emotions that are inevitably wrapped up in this? How are we protecting the child within the writing, much like we adults would want to be protected? So take a moment and in the chat box, you know, just think about, how do we teach kids to care for each other's writing? Because that goes beyond a checklist. And so I'm just going to drink my tea for a moment. And if you want to just throw some ideas in the chat box, that would be wonderful. So we've got building class community, how to give feedback, truly listen first. Yeah. Great ideas, right? But is that enough? And that's what I keep coming back to. Model acceptance of the choices each writers make. Yes, good. Modeling feedback, response. And so much of it comes down to community, right? You know, I think about how if I'm going to share my writing with someone, it's because I deeply trust them. And so when I was writing Passionate Readers, which I was really nervous about, because how dare I write a book about reading since I'm still on this journey, you know, the people that I shared it with were really trusted people who would bring in different opinions and different lenses to my writing. And I also knew that they would give me a certain level of honesty that would push me forward and not just go, oh, it's great. Because that's the thing. Often when we teach kids, you know, handle each other's writing with care, kids take that to the extreme of, I can't actually say anything constructive because that's going to upset someone. And so we have to figure out this balance of like, it's not going to be helpful if you just say, oh, it's great, and I have no ideas. Now, sometimes kids don't actually have any ideas. So one of the central questions that is one of the central questions that I pursued. And so one of the tools that we started implementing last year, and so this is very much in the infancy stages, and I didn't get to see it play out because it was hard to maintain when we went into crisis teaching, is this idea of bringing in writing circles. And so I wanted to show, because it's at first when I heard about the idea, I was like, okay, I'm going to Google writing circles, and I didn't find very much. So I was like, okay, I there's this idea, and the idea, I'll go back to that, comes from Comprehension and Collaboration by Daniels and Harvey. It was mentioned as kind of an aside, and I was like, this is really interesting. And so I had to wrap my own head around, like, okay, when I say writing circle, what is it we mean? And so a writing circle is much like a literature circle in the sense that you have 3 or 4 people and you are sharing a common purpose. For me, our writing circles typically last for the project, sometimes the quarter or longer. And also a cool side effect that I started noticing this year, first year of implementation, was that kids started gravitating towards people that they had been in writing circles with, that when they were working on other stuff where we weren't necessarily in an official writing circle. They can write around the same topic, but formats can be all different, or they're all doing the same project. So such as we had them last for our TED Talks, but then they all are writing on their own topic, but they're using the same format. And so there's some play there, because you could say, okay, your writing circle is going to be almost your inquiry group. You're all going to be writing about, I don't know, global warming. But you're going to maybe write different things. So somebody's going to write poetry about global warming. Somebody's going to write research paper about global warming, etc. You use your group not only to help you edit and revise, but that's definitely part of it, but also to help you create, to sit in the brainstorm portion of it, to sit in the kind of the doubting portion. Oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know what questions to ask, etc. You really use them as a strong community, because your group can offer you positive feedback. They can push your skills. That is very much part of it. They can push your thinking. They can, help you whenever you get stuck, etc., and help you grow as a writer. And this was something huge that I had to point out to my students. This isn't just, I'm going to go find my people and we're going to sit with my friends and we're going to hang out and we're going to pretend that we're talking about writing. This is your chance to find people, and they might be your friends or they might not be people you know yet, that you can sit and they can push you as a writer. And I've told my students that as well. My job as their teacher is to help them grow as writers. If I sit there and just go, oh, that's good, that's nice, and I don't push them through constructive feedback, then I haven't done my job. And so we use games in the beginning to get to continue like the relationship, especially because I try to put kids in different groups, and I'll show you how I put them in groups in a second. I give very specific ideas for work every few days. So in our class, it'd be like, in your writing circle, today, please discuss whatever it is that we're working on. We have time built in for the writing circle. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. In the beginning of the year, when we first started using it, I was like, oh, you could use your writing circle. And of course, kids were like, nope, I just want to work. So now it's like, nope, we're all getting in our writing circles, and this is what we're doing. They share their work, discuss, they encourage. They then serve as editors for each other. So no more forced partnerships with the peer editing list. This also builds long-term accountability as well as writing partners, and they also build accountability towards the group. Hey, how's it going? Are you as far as you want it to be? What do you still need to work on? So because I wanted to get out of the whole idea of forced partnerships, I wanted to make sure that students got to have a huge say over who was going to be in their writing circle interviews or writing circles. So we created a writing circle interview, which looks very similar to our book club interviews. And so this is a big one. I think they interview 7 or 8 people, because that also pushes them outside of their immediate peer circle for the most part, especially since I teach 7th graders, where some of them definitely already are very much in groups. And so they first kind of go through a reflection of their own writing skills. So we think about pace of writing. Are you a careful writer where you really have to sit and think about your words? You weigh your words heavily. These tend to be kids too that don't write as many drafts because they've already kind of done a lot of thinking up front. Are you kind of average? Or are you fast? Are you someone that just gets a lot of ideas? How do you see yourself as a writer? And I use the word bad writer because that's the term that many of my students use. So it's not a term that I introduce. It's a term that some of my students already feel are part of their identity. And we, of course, kind of unpack it and unravel it throughout the year. When you're sitting in a discussion group, how much do you speak? Because I'm not going to put a kid who doesn't talk very much with someone who talks a lot, because then I know what's going to happen in that conversation. What is your feedback style? Are you brutally honest? Or are you kind of like calm or careful? Or are you whatever the person wants me to be? And I try to say that to my students. I tend to be more brutally honest, but students will also start to figure out, like, and as they tell me, like, Mrs. Ripp, I don't need brutal honesty. I just need you to look at this one. Then what growth areas do they have themselves? And this changes kind of depending on the project, because this is an interview sheet that they use throughout the year because their needs are going to change. And so this one was specifically for a narrative story, our first narrative story, personal essay or memoir. And these were some of the big things that we felt like we were working on. And now, what can you teach others? What are something that you consider yourself decent at? And we talk about this too, because a lot of my kids, especially those who have very negative writing identities, will say like, well, I can't teach anybody anything. And I'm like, I don't think that's true. So let's talk about that. Then they go around to 7 of their peers and they ask the same questions. On the bottom of the sheet, the final page, it will say like, who are people who now go through and start to compare? Who would make a good fit? And I walk kids through this because this is where it's like, this is where it matters. If I'm sitting and I went up to my best friend in my class and I consider myself a careful writer, someone who's average at writing, I don't talk very much in discussions, and I'm a careful editor, but my best friend is someone who's super fast, thinks they are like, I am a great writer. They talk a lot and they're brutally honest. Maybe we're not going to be a good fit. But also, if my best friend and I can help people in the same skills, then it doesn't make sense for us to be together. And so kids give me 2 or 3 names of kids that they interviewed that they think will be a good fit for their writing circle. And they also have the mortal enemy clause, which we have on our book club sheets as well. If they have someone where there has been some intense friendship fallout going on that I'm not aware of, or maybe they really did horribly together in another class or in 6th grade or whatever, they have the mortal enemy clause and they could write down names. Now, I tell them, most of you will leave this blank. Most of you don't have some sort of secret beef with someone. And this isn't your chance to like write all the people who you think would be annoying to be with so that you only get to be with your friends. And so we talk about what that clause is for. They then hand me these massive interview packets, and then I sit and it's a puzzle. Who can I put together? Who would be a good fit? Looking at how they've evaluated themselves, who would work together, etc. This is another part of kind of them establishing their writing process, right? Because this also allows them to go, wait, what do I need to work on? And also, what can I contribute to a conversation? And I think that that is so important, that kids can see that they all have something to contribute, but also acknowledge that they all have something that they would like to get better at. Are there any questions on writing circles? I'll kind of I'll show you some examples as far as like what the beginning of it looks like, but I don't want to take up too much more time. So throw them in. So you know what, the writing circle interviews, if you go to my blog, pernillesripp.com, and put in writing circles, I believe I have an entire blog post dedicated to this with links to everything. And so Lisa had asked about kind of like, how do you navigate the best friends who always gravitate towards each other? I keep an eye on it because sometimes they do work really well together. And sometimes it also becomes like, okay, well, if you're in a writing circle, but that also means you're not going to be together for other things. And so because there's a lot of different collaborative opportunities throughout the year, I'm actually not opposed to best friends being together if they work well together. I just don't want them to be together all of the time. I am, how will I do writing circles in the fall if it's virtual? Um, I'm thinking that there's going to be some sort of accountability groups as far as like some breakouts, and I don't know. I haven't fully formed my head around it because I'm still in the weird. We're not sure what my district is doing. I'm guessing my district is probably going to be hybrid, or fully virtual. And so once that decision is made, I can start planning, because if it's hybrid, then I want to plant the seeds for the writing circles while we're face to face. Like most of my face to face time with my students, if we're hybrid, is going to be about community and building connections and setting up all of these collaborative tools. And then we're going to be scheduling time outside of class, that I'm going to have the kids make sure that they can work together at designated times outside of class. And so while this is still like an artificial construct, what I did see last year in my experimentation with this was that kids started to acknowledge that they needed other people to be a part of their writing, and that other people should be invested in their writing from the beginning. Not, oh, I'm ready for someone to edit and revise. It also freed me up to have other conversations with kids, because they were using their writing circles. If the writing circle was going well, they were going straight to their writing circle with things, rather than coming straight to the teacher going, I don't know how to do this. And so I want to really focus on these next year too. And so I'll show you here. So this was just like, okay, I've now revealed their writing circles, and now I'm watching, right? How are they going to work together? And we did the grab a Jenga game where we had questions on the Jenga games. And there are questions like, what's your favorite season? Or is a hot dog a sandwich? Or how many holes does a straw have? Things that are kind of like fun for kids to discuss. And then they just sit and they play a game. And I think that once you reveal any kind of collaborative group, I think it's important to put kids in like a game situation or some sort of, not icebreaker, because icebreakers make me super nervous myself, but some sort of way for them to talk to each other before they jump into kind of the work. The Jenga game activity was not my idea. Trisha Barvia had tweeted it out with all of her questions. And so I simply took her questions that she so gracefully shared, and then I just tweaked some of them. Also, some. But if you Google, oh, okay, and there's the writing circles post. Thank you. It should come up. After they had done the game, so this is still the first day of their writing circle, then I wanted them to talk about the rules of writing. And this was something that we talked about before, and write them down on the paper. They got a big piece of paper. And then I wanted them to think about, how do these rules help? How do these rules hurt you? And then how is your writing identity tied in with the rules of writing? So this was a few weeks into school where we'd already talked about, when does writing suck and when is it amazing? And we'd created our writing rights. And we'd really started to talk about the language of writing and our writing identity. So this wasn't the first time that kids had seen these terms. And it was super fascinating to see just how many rules they could come up with. Like the sentence rule came up, 5 paragraphs came up. You must always, capitalize proper nouns, etc. Your dialogue needs to look like this. You cannot start a sentence with and, etc. And so we needed to talk about those so that we could talk about, well, what is their purpose and what happens when we start playing with the rules? And so once they had brainstormed, and we'd brainstormed as a class, this was kind of our class discussion. And I'm going to hopefully play you. I'm not going to play you. It's going to open up another tab. Let's see what happens. It's a 19-second clip from Jason Reynolds. Nope, it's not going to want to play. Silly. I should have checked that. We'll go back. But in this clip, Jason Reynolds talks about how writers shouldn't be afraid to break the rules. And of course, my students know Jason Reynolds, because if they don't already know his work, we've already introduced it in 7th grade. He's one of the first authors that I book talk and hold up all of his amazing books. I highly encourage you to Google this clip of Jason Reynolds discussing writing rules. It's like I said, 20 seconds. And he's just like, you need to break the rules. You need to write what you need to write. And so this would be once they've done that, we've had that conversation. So you can see this is a longer class chunk. This is like a 45-minute class chunk because I think it's really important to establish kind of that writing circle. Then I wanted them to do a group story. Oh, now it's playing. I got to figure out where it's playing from. Give me a second.
Think about your book or your writing, for that matter, without the rules. Write anything back and fix later, but you cannot fix what does not exist.
So I have YouTube somehow playing in the background.
I have one writing tip.
Pernille, I think
Yeah.
I think you probably have a different browser and you're showing us
Yeah, I know.
slides.
Yep. Give me 1 second. I just needed to make sure I was stopping it. I don't know where it popped up, so it is what it is. So, but now you could at least get to it. So, thinking about this, why have them do a group story? Well, it was important to me that that they got to start creating together and also had some fun. And so I told them simply that their story needed to make sense and they had to have a surprise, a fish, and a yogurt in it. And this was also just to make sure that the group had some fun with it. And then everything else is up to you. And of course, most of these stories were super goofy. So, most of these stories were kind of all over the place, but it allowed us to start creating together. And so I think about the components because one thing is when we make beautiful writing groups, that's great. But then how do we get kids to actually work as a community? And that's also things that we need to teach them. And that's something that we need to teach them every single year because kids change. Group dynamics change, skills change. And so we can't just assume that, oh, in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, they have done all of the collaborative group work. So kids already know how to function in groups. Yes, but do kids know how to function in groups the way that we would like them to now? And I'm not saying by handing them a ton of set of rules or handing them specific set roles. Are they going to work together collaboratively to actually push their own craft as writers? Because there's a very big reason that I don't give kids specific roles within their writing group because I don't want them to see that as a limitation. And so instead, I just do specific teaching of things that they can use their writing circle for, because it comes back to this, right? That writing centers on choice. And this also means that how can we give kids free choice? Even if the product is removed as far as a choice, how are they then using choice still to establish and continue their writing identity journey? So are they choosing how they write as far as like, are they typing? Are they handwriting? Are they dictating? When are they writing within the block? When do they want to meet with people? When do they want to sit and think? When do they want to sit and write? Now, this isn't like, oh, you can choose to not write today. It really has to do with like where in the time that we have together can we sink into writing. Question from Lisa is, do you open the year with writing or reading circles? Which comes first? Writing circles. Reading book clubs, etc. That does not happen until November because we need to focus on independent reading first. Before my students have done a ton of work with book clubs. They have not done a ton of work with collaborative writing, at least not last year's kids. Choice in what they write whenever we're able to do so. How are they sharing? Are they even sharing? Who are they sharing with? What does sharing look like? And of course, also, what is assessed within their writing? And this gets a little bit tricky. So that's not always a choice that kids have, because sometimes, the reason they're writing is so that we can give them feedback on certain things and focus on certain standards. And so I wanted to say, too, here, once again, we have to look at our standards and kind of start examining and make sure that they're not product based. And so this is my very real standard that I operate under in English 7, which is this write narrative to develop real or imagined experience or events using effective technique, relevant descriptive details, and well-structured event sequences. So notice how that's not tied to a single product. This is huge because it allows me, rather than to say to students, I need you to write a personal narrative memoir, I can say I need a narrative. And it can be a memoir, or it can be a personal essay, or you can invent something if you don't feel comfortable sharing about your life. This is huge because we often expect kids to just reveal everything there is about themselves without thinking about trust and community first. especially kids who have had trauma or who feel distrust or disengaged or not safe in our classrooms. When we then say, now you're going to do narrative writing, we are pushing them into a territory that they're not agreeing to go with us. And then we wonder why kids shut down. And so I think about this narrative writing. There's a lot of different directions that kids can take with this. They could do a choose your own adventure, which I've had students do, 34 pages, 54 pages of stories. They could create YouTube videos, right, where they're writing out the scripts and acting them. They could create a picture book where they collaborate with another creator who does the drawings, and the drawing becomes a story in themselves. They can do free verse. I had a student do a 50 plus pages free verse story about a puppy getting lost in a city. They could create a graphic novel, or they could just write a narrative story. But I think about that. When we look at our standards, are we seeing the potential of choice rather than limitations of the standard itself? And it took me a while to kind of switch my frame to that, because at first I was like, oh, well, it says narrative, so they're going to write a narrative story, beginning, middle, end. Here's how it's going to look. We're going to pull up the story mountain. And then I think about, too, that we need to, like, the story mountain is another scaffold, right, that we need to also question. It's fantastic for kids who still haven't figured out how to, like, write a story that isn't a summary where it actually has movement and character change in it. But for kids who've already figured that out, how can we play with timeline so it's not that story mountain or the plot diagram, and instead it's like, ooh, we have flashbacks, we have other things that we can put into our story. And then I think about free choice, too, that sometimes it's simply the furniture that stands in the way of writing. If you haven't sat in your own chairs, I would highly recommend that if you get to go back into your classroom and sit there for a period of time. Don't just sit there for a little bit, because I started sitting in my own furniture during our meetings whenever they were in my classroom, and I quickly realized how absolutely uncomfortable everything was, which is no surprise. And so one of the things, and the reason I share this picture, right, is that I would not choose to lay in that fashion or to lie across a yoga ball in that way. But this was working for my students. This was how they were working together. And that was actually a collaborative group that was all, splayed out like that. And it worked. It worked for them. The other thing we have to think about, and this is something that we have talked about repeatedly throughout this masterclass, is also kind of this idea of language, right? That what we say to students matters. And I think about the words by Kelly Gallagher, where he said, we don't have final products. It's always the best draft of wherever we're at. And that is so important, because for me, the minute I say, okay, your final story, your final product, the final version, when I say that to students, yes, they will give me their final version, and then they are done. And then if I go back and try to give them feedback and we want to continue the revision editing process, they're not interested, because you told me it was the final version. Now instead we say, okay, this is the best draft of where we're at right now. That leaves it open to feedback. That leaves it open to, I'm going to continue with this work and make sure that I'm going to go back and do some more work. Now, that revision may not happen until later. I think and I have a slide in here about this, I think it's really important to walk away when we feel like we're kind of at the best place we can be, walk away for a couple of weeks, if not longer, before we come back and revise and edit. If we don't do the walk away, kids can't see how they need to grow, just like we can't as adults. When I send in a draft of a book, that is my best draft. And if I sat down the very next day and was like, oh, now I'm going to start revising it, I'd be like, no, that's my best draft. And I just want to throw in Nick Stone's process here, right? Like, this is her writing process. How many of our students have a writing process like this, right? I love that it's like revision is her least favorite part. So I asked on Twitter, and it's a fantastic thread. There were a lot of children's book authors that were willing to share. And I just said, hey, children's book authors, will you share how many drafts you write typically? And it was so interesting to see all of the different answers that were given. And so, for example, when Aiden became a brother, which is one of my favorite picture books to come out in 2019, 3 major overhauls, multiple drafts in between, so probably 20 to 30. But look at Kim Bradley, 9, only 9 for The War I Finally Won. You can see, so Auntie Faye's Kelly Barnhill, of course, who won Girl Who Drank the Moon, won the Newbery, 100 drafts for that book. Matt de la Pena saying 50 drafts of Last Stop on Market Street, which also won the Newbery, tried about 20 different endings. And then he said in a follow-up tweet, which I didn't have room for, he goes, my final ending was actually the fourth one I had written. And he goes, I just wanted to see what else was out there. And so I think about this, why aren't we bringing this into the class? You know, using again, authors to say, look at this, Water is Water, another amazing 100 drafts, right? And because she was trying alternate ways of storytelling. Because we're so focused on taking kids through the motions and going, today's lesson is this, and you're going to work on this, and on this day you're going to be done, and on this day you're going to be revising, and this day you're going to be editing, and then you're going to be finished, we're not actually engaging them in what writers do, which is tons of different drafts, and sometimes changing the stories fundamentally, sometimes changing the story from a third person narrator to a first person narrator, you know, sometimes changing the ages of people. And so I also asked them, I said, when is a draft done, in your opinion? And I chuckled at some of these answers, right? Again, Kelly Barnhill, when someone pulls it out of my cold, dead hands, right? But Margarita Engel's like, I could read it as a reader without feeling the need to revise again. Melissa Stewart, who is a prolific nonfiction writer, an editor accepted it. That means it's done. And so I think about this all the time. And Cynthia Levinson's work is so important. What counts as a draft, right? When do we decide as teachers and also as students of what a draft looks like? And I just think that that is so important. And so thinking about this, again, coming back to this static writing process that we have been passing on to kids, why is this the way we say kids need to be writing, when this is not what authors actually do? Some do, but not everybody. How powerful would it be if we could take this circle diagram and have kids create their own at the end of the year? What is your writing process? Who are you as a writer? And so we also have to think about what we're asking kids to do. And again, this really comes from the inspiration from the book, Why They Can't Write. Does your topic actually need to be complex? Because what are we really asking to do asking students to do in their writing? So I was going to have you answer this in the chat box, but with all the funny technical difficulties, I'm running out of time. We were having students write a research paper for their TED Talks in 7th grade. And it wasn't until my special education teacher pointed out just how many concepts and executive skills, functioning skills that students were actually working on for the research paper, let alone finding the research and creating the paper. And so one of the things that we have realized and recognized is to say, okay, we're going to do an inquiry into inquiry. So I can teach you how to do research. And not so much so that you can produce a research paper right now, but so instead you can learn the different steps of how you do research. And that's the product, you learning how to do that, etc. Because when we sit down and we say, okay, we're going to have kids create a presentation, we're assuming a lot of things, even as they're older, that they already know how to do. And because we're so focused on that final product, we're not thinking about all of the things that we're assuming kids already know how to do. And so I think about John Warner's book, and I've shouted it out a couple times because it really has opened my eyes to things that I was wondering but didn't have enough knowledge to know about, that if kids are not writing like real writers, then what do we need to change in our instruction? Because why is it, like my mom is a professor at UW-Madison, a literature professor, and she'll say, my students don't know how to write. Why is it after 13 years in public schools and kids getting accepted into these beautiful colleges and having the grades, they can't go and write something that matters in college? Why is it that kids will tell us that, oh, I do outside writing, but that's not what schools want me to do? And so we have to start removing restrictions. And so when I think about this, it's important that we have kids do authentic writing rather than writing simulations, which is really what it ends up being. So I want to, yes, we're getting to the assessment piece. It'll be kind of the last piece. So one of the things that we use is having writing explorations, right? And so one of the ones that he uses is how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's technical writing, and it really helped my students have a lot of aha moments about complexity of their writing, about details of their writing, about thinking of their audience while they're writing, etc., rather than me standing up in front of them and going, you should write really detailed. When we take your instructions and this is the result of the instructions that you wrote for a peanut butter jelly sandwich, then your writing didn't work. And that's going to be a much more powerful lesson than me just saying it. So assessment ties in with better revision. And so really what I think about when I'm assessing is, what is the process that they're working on and what is the possibility that I see for them? So in order to assess, we need to do better revision first. So first of all, we step away. I already said I do like a week or two or more before we come back to a project. For me, when I'm assessing, I want to focus on one next step. Because for too long, we have pulled out our metaphorical red pen and have pointed out all of the weaknesses in their writing. That's overwhelming, especially for a kid who's sitting there going, I tried. I always think about, like, what is the one step that I want you to take, because that's going to make your writing more powerful. Are there other things to work on? 100%, but we're going to focus on that at a different time. We read our work aloud. Our ears can hear more than our eyes can see. We've also used the tip or the trick where you change the font into a different size and a different type of font, because that allows our eyes and our brain to reset the connections that we've already created where we don't see words that are missing or words that don't make sense. We print them out and we edit on paper. This also becomes an assessment tool for me because I can see how much kids have changed. I do not sit in Google or in Microsoft Word or whatever tool we use and leave comments right there, specific comments, because then it just becomes a checklist for the kids. When I'm assessing, I want to see their growth. And so having them print out their document if they typed it, and then them doing the fixing in pen or whatever way they choose, then I can see, are they catching what they need to catch? Everybody edits and revises. There's no one that is like exempt for it. Of course, we choose how to work for it and we plan for it. And so this also then ties in with, and I'll come back to some more assessment stuff, is questioning the programs that we're putting kids into. So if the scripted curriculum that your students have been placed into is harming the child's love of learning or creating further inequities, then we need to stop using it. And we need to have some pretty brave conversations about the programs that we're using. Because here's the thing, there is no single approach to writing instruction that's going to meet the needs of all students. And I think we see that play out in our classroom all the time. We see why the opportunity gap is not decreasing. And yet we keep implementing these programs and saying, well, just follow this program with fidelity and it's going to close every gap. It's going to bring every kid up to par. That's simply not true. So before we get to assessment, we have to think about, how did I support this child? For me, honestly, assessment is really easy to do because I've seen their writing from the moment that they started it to when they handed it in. I've been doing assessment throughout because I've been teaching and they've been learning from their writing circle and from themselves as far as how they need to grow. And I've seen that grow on paper. So here, I just want to make sure we get to the assessment slide. Here are just a few tips for if you are working within scripted curriculum. Detours when needed, right? Figure out how to personalize, even if the product is the same. Like, how can you still add in choice? How can you put the center of the heart of the child into it? And then, of course, ask your students, how can I make this better? How can I make this more personal? What are ways that we could change this and make it better? So assessment starts with our writing conferences. We do a lot of writing conferences throughout. And instead of me having them pull up their work and then saying, oh, this is what I want you to work on, I ask the child to tell me what they would like to work on. Now, that also means that I've done lessons on specific things so that kids know what they could have me look on or look at. So, for example, if we've been doing a mini lesson on descriptive writing and adding in sensory details, I can say to kids, like, things that you can ask me to look at are sensory details, dialogue, punctuation is still a big one in 7th grade, organization, your word choice, the voice that you're trying, the perspective you're trying. This is so that I can transfer writing terminology over to them. So it's not just some random lesson, but they can look at their own paper and say, oh, I really want you to focus on this. This is huge because I need them to take over control over their own writing journey. This also allows them to steer the focus. So instead of me sitting and staring at their writing for 15 minutes, it's a much quicker process because I'm only looking at that one thing that they want me to focus on. And we then talk about what is the thing that you need to go and now do. This means that it calls for specific revisions, and it means I can meet with more students. Kids can meet with me as many times as they want, but it's so that they can take that one thing that they need to work on and go back and come back up. And this is part of my assessment. I take notes on this. I have a conferring sheet. And so again, when a child then comes and says, when you're done, you've only just begun, wonderful. Start another draft of something. I love Ruth Ayer's books if you haven't read it. So when we talk about assessment, it's then also important to say, what would you like me to look at and why, especially if it's a kid that has done multiple drafts. If it's a child that's only done one draft, well, then it's easy, right? They always self-assess first. So I believe my next slide here, right here, this is a sample rubric, a short story draft rubric, back when I was still using multiple rubrics. Now I just use a single point rubric, which I've written about on my blog. But kids have to be able to, first of all, understand what are the different skills, and then they also go in and they assess themselves first. And if they can't assess themselves first, then I have not done a good enough job in teaching them what I'm actually looking for in their writing and what the purpose of the writing is. And so the student reflection, and this is just an example reflection, is, of course, what are you good at as a writer? List as many things as you would like. This is a very important question to ask kids because kids often don't have this part of their conversation. Then how did you grow as a writer in this process? This came from a lot of kids after we had done like a 3-week-long project, which they would say, I didn't grow. Okay. Well, going back to part 2 of this masterclass, and that can be found in the recordings on Q's website and on their YouTube channel, right, is what was the goal that you initially set out to make? So this all ties together. What was the goal you were working on? Okay, did you meet that goal? And sometimes kids are like, no, I forgot about it. Oh, okay. What did you then work on instead? Then I want kids to think about what's their next step. What is it you want to work on in your personal writing journey? What is important for you? Then how can I help you? Because I also want kids to see us as people who can support, and not just in an overall way. I'd like them to be specific. Hey, Miss Ripp, can you help me out when my organization doesn't make sense? Or, hey, Miss Ripp, can you help me with dialogue? Because I always forget about dialogue. I want to be a thought partner for them, and I think it's important that they start to kind of demand that we help them in certain ways. Again, this depends on where you're at with your students and their age group, but even little kids can say like, oh, I wish you would help me go further in my story, or do a longer story, is like what my own kids would say. And then how do you write best? What is your writing process now? And so this is a question that we come back to all the time. My student reflection doesn't always look like this. Sometimes it's like, what are you really proud of? And what do you need to work on? And how are you going to work on that? And I think that that's also a really important question to ask students in their assessment. How are you going to work on whatever it is you say your goal is? Because otherwise they're just going to set the goal and they're going to forget all about it. So Lisa has a great question with, do you get adult pushback on how much is wrong with a best draft piece? I don't actually. Where I get the pushback is that those at home sometimes are like, okay, so their best draft is due then, but when is their final draft due? And so I think it also, and I always just tell them, I'm like, no, but really that is like that I said there is no final, like writing is a continual process. I do a lot of front loading though with those at home too, about like how we're focusing on different things in writing and the growth that I am looking for. And I also try to be really specific with the feedback that I give. That's why it's also really important for me that I write out. So like the strength, there's a lot of different strengths on there. And then next step as a writer is only one thing. So I think a lot of it comes down to the front loading. So one of the questions that I want to make sure that I ask my students when whether it's because I've given them feedback on their best draft or in the writing conference is how are you going to use the feedback I've given you in either your current or your next piece of writing? And that's a great idea to have them write that down in their writer's notebook too. I think often we use writer's notebooks just to write in, but I think it's also important to use it as a way to gather feedback and to set goals and then to think of plans for it. So I want to honor your time, and I recognize that I've gone over schedule, and I apologize for that. So for me, this whole masterclass has really been trying to just make a transparency into my classroom. This is very much a journey that I'm on myself, and I'll probably write more about it this coming year too, especially with the whole virtual thrown into it. But for me, if I can sum everything up, this is it, right? That the whole process is centered on exploring writing identity. Everything I do is to transfer control and power over to my students. Integrated choice throughout wherever it works. That one-on-one personalization. I can't personalize if I don't know the person in front of me. Writing as a community, authentic writing that matters, and of course, examining all of the processes and the things that we put in place that we say real writers do without actually thinking about the obstacles or the harm that that statement can make for students. And so I leave you with this quote. I think that writing is storytelling, and we have to get back to that, whether it's informational, persuasive, or narrative, right? This is what we have to think about, that we have to create opportunities for storytelling in our nation because we're losing a huge part of who we are. And so for me, I really want to come back to writing as storytelling in any kind of part that they do. So I'll take questions here in a moment, but for me, I really want my writing instruction to go beyond just students who know how to write. I want kids to know themselves as writers and see value in their writing, whatever their path may be in their future lives, both professionally but also personally. So I wanted to say that the next session is going to switch to reading. And so next Wednesday at 1 p.m. CST, I'm kicking off just a single session on passionate readers, but then it's going to jump into reading identity the following 3 sessions after that. So passionate readers, you can read the description here, is kind of an overview of philosophy as far as what I do in reading and questions that we should work through. And then the masterclass, but they still hate reading, developing reading identity is like, what does that now look like? So they all do go together. But I just wanted to put that plug in. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, hopefully. Let's see here. And take a few questions, and otherwise 2 questions. Again, I'll have office hours tomorrow night at 9 p.m. I did notice the question at the bottom. I will not be repeating the part 1 of writing since it wasn't recorded. I asked Microsoft and they said, nope. No, basically. I might do it in like the Passionate Readers Facebook group. I don't know. I'm also trying to find the balance about not working all of the time. And right now that's not going so well, as my kids will attest to. So because I'm doing these classes every single week all summer, right now I don't have a week off. So I'm trying to be really mindful of not adding more work. The recordings should be posted fairly quickly. Q and Microsoft take care of that. I've noticed it's usually a couple of days. Lisa's question, if you're working on a narrative, how are they then going to work on it in an informational essay? That's a question that I pose with the kids because we often don't go from like narrative to narrative to narrative, right? And so instead, it's thinking more broadly. If my goal in narrative writing was to add more details, how does that then transfer into an informational essay? Because details is kind of a broad thing. It might just look different than it would in a narrative where I'm really trying to establish a scene and a mood. In an informational essay, I want to make sure I bring the reader along to make sure that they understand the topic. So some goals translate really well, and others are like, we're going to tuck this one in our pocket, and next time we do some free writing, we're going to look at this one. So yeah, other questions? I'll gladly take them.